So what I'm going to be talking about today is Georgian Pingbacks, and my Twitter handle is just mhbeals. Nothing in here is privileged, so tweet to your heart's content. Georgian Pingbacks, the title comes from modern pingbacks, which a colleague of mine thought sounded like an African frog, but is actually a reference to blogs. So if you mention somebody else's blog in yours, they will get a little automatic comment on their blog that's called a pingback, letting you know that somebody has mentioned you in their own blog or piece of journalism. Now, in the Georgian period, so the late 18th and early 19th century in Britain, they did not have the luxury of pingbacks. If somebody stole a bit of your content, there was no real way for you to know someone had done it unless you happened to read the newspaper that had done it. So what I'm trying to do is, thanks to digital collections, sort of reverse engineer scissors and paste journalism. So, as my colleague Stephen has already quite well described, scissors and paste journalism is a long-standing practice wherein one newspaper reprints in part or in whole, and there is quite a lot of variation, content from another newspaper with or without attribution, again quite a lot of variation, as part of an explicit or implied reciprocity agreement. Now, reciprocity agreements between newspapers could be quite formal, but it could just be that they subscribed to your newspapers, cut out the bits they liked, and reprinted it as they saw fit. But it might be something more formal. A former apprentice might have gone to a new newspaper and they sent papers back and forth, or they actually engaged in fairly regular transmission of their periodicals. In both Britain and the United States in the early 19th century, newspapers could be sent through the post between editors at a free or subsidized rate. So it really wanted to encourage scissors and paste journalism as much as possible. So how do we find these different cases of plagiarism? Well, we could do it the old-fashioned way, find a particular newspaper we like, and then try to find it in one of the other many search engines, and there's a lot of problems with this. First and foremost, for anybody who's used a newspaper search engine, OCR, or optical character recognition, is the bane of your existence. Even in late 19th and early 20th century printing, the font isn't always perfectly readable. In the late 18th and early 19th century, you're really just hoping that it'll catch the words that you've put into the search engine. You might get some of the reprints, but not necessarily all of them. So what I've decided to do instead is to take a more holistic search for these reprints. Very kindly, the British Library has given me part of their 19th century collection, the original JISC-funded portion, and I took the entire thing and put it through CopyFind, which is a plagiarism detection software. Now, CopyFind, which is quite similar to Turnitin, has a lot of advantages over Turnitin. First of all, it's not on the cloud. I'm not cluttering up Turnitin with millions and millions of newspaper articles. But it gives me quite a large amount of flexibility in how I search. So the text isn't terribly clear, but you can see the coloration. The red text is identical text. Character for character, period for period, space for space are the same in these two articles. The blue is a little bit more fuzzy. So I can allow up to 10, 20, 30 mistakes, however many I want to, with this particular program. In this case, I've used, it has to be at least 10 words, but allows a lot of mistakes. So I'm really getting at least a couple sentences that are being reprinted, not just a stray turn of phrase, and allowing for a lot of OCR errors. So once I put the entire corpus through plagiarism detection software, we get a big list of reprinting matches. You can create a social network diagram using a program called Gephi, and the thicker the line, the more copying has taken place. And I'll read some of these titles to you as it hasn't appeared here very well. Over here, you have the Morning Chronicle in London, and you have the Caledonian Mercury up in Edinburgh. And the color indicates which direction it's going. Basically, the Caledonian Mercury was just taking everything the Morning Chronicle had to offer and reprinting it a few days later in Edinburgh. So this gives you a really good idea of what newspapers had a common sphere of knowledge. It doesn't necessarily say that the Caledonian Mercury copied from the Morning Chronicle, although I happen to know it did, from other contextual sources. But it does give you an idea that the articles that appeared in one also appeared in the other. But there's very little that gives us an indication of how much of this information was known to readers at the time. Now, the way that readers at the time would receive that information was through attribution. We can still try to sort of retroactively create an idea of who's copying who, however, from other contextual details. So, if you take this little program, which I was able to write, and run the list of matches through it, it accounts for the difference in time between the two publications, the difference in geography, how physically far apart they were. You know, something can't appear in Boston and then the next day appear in London in 1800. It's just not physically possible. And also the degree of plagiarism. Now, I quite like the reprint editors, the reprint exchange editors, but I also think they were fundamentally lazy. I think Stephen's example was actually a pretty proactive exchange editor. And if somebody is copying sort of mindlessly, they don't make very many changes. So I made a couple assumptions in this project, that if you have two possible ancestors, the one that it's most closely matching, the one they've changed the least, is likely where they got it from. That's an assumption. It's not perfect, but to do an entire corpus, it's a good heuristic. And what you have at the end is this list of likely ancestor-descendant relationships. Now, I would like to thank very much my students who volunteered their time to go through this list of 30,000 matches and make sure there were no false negatives or false positives in it, which they very kindly did in these final columns. And what I found is that this heuristic had about a 2% false positive and about a 2% false negative discrepancy. So there were lots, and most of the false positives were advertisements, usually for the lottery or patent medicines, which tended to pop up all over the country. And once you have that, you can build a directed Indiana Jones style guide. And you can actually trace where each individual piece of information, each text, is moving through the entire network. And what is really interesting about this is that there's not the same metropolitan-provincial relationship I originally expected. Now, I thought not necessarily that all the news came from London and went out to the provinces, but I thought that London would be fairly internal, that it would not necessarily bring in a huge amount of information from the provincial parts of Britain. And I found that using these sort of heuristics, that's simply not the case. While the Morning Chronicle liked to send lots of information out, people were copying the Morning Chronicle, both Cobbett's Weekly Political Register and especially the Examiner brought in lots of provincial news. So if you were in London and you wanted to know what was going on back in Bristol or Manchester or Edinburgh, the Examiner was the one you could look for. And as far as I know, having examined the explicit text of the Examiner, this was not part of its selling point. This isn't something it advertised, but it was clearly a market that it must have been providing for. And that's something we can only really tell from this sort of implicit reprint analysis. But implicit reprint analysis are based on assumptions. I made assumptions about how long it takes to get from London to Edinburgh based on postal routes, or how likely it is that you're going to copy full stop for full stop or word for word. We also have actual attributions on a smaller percentage of these reprints. So it might be something like this, Friday's Post, which for the Ipswich Journal meant post from London. You have Ipswich, November 10th, so someone in the town told him this information at some point. And then here, the Dumfries Courier. And that one I found really amazing, that this small town in the borders of Scotland was being reprinted in Ipswich, way down in the south of England. And it really gave me a different perspective of how important the Dumfries Courier was, which I had always sort of classed as a very provincial Dumfries newspaper. So how do we go about getting these attributions? Well, some of my colleagues in Boston have tried to do it automatically through OCR, but as we've already established, OCR is not your friend, and there can be lots of mistakes. There are also the difficulties of newspaper owners were not terribly creative in how they named their newspapers. The Gazette, the Chronicle, the Postman, over and over and over again, and often these attributions would just say, the Courier. Your guess as to which one. So what I've tried to do is use crowdsourcing as a way to really tackle some, if not all, of these difficulties. The project is called Georgian Pingbacks, as I said before, and the little frog does make an appearance. I would like to again thank my undergraduates who tested the tutorial and made sure it all made sense before sending it into the wider world. Now, the Georgian Pingbacks project has 3 different stages. You can validate articles, which basically says, does this image appear, and is it an article and not an advert? Pretty simple. You can do it on your mobile phone if you're really bored on the train. You can also transcribe articles. Now that is really to help us compare the OCR with a good human transcription, so we can start to correct very specific OCRs for these specific attributions. So instead of trying to do a general correction to the OCR, how does the Dumfries Courier usually show up with this OCR technology? But the most important one for me is tag datelines. Now if you go to tag datelines, you go to a little tutorial which explains how attributions in 19th century newspapers work, where they might be in the newspaper article, how they might be framed, and why on earth the editor might include them. And so this page, for example, explains closers, the little dash and then the name at the end, and how you would recognize it. And there's a little quiz at the bottom to make sure you've actually understood what I've tried to explain to you. Once you successfully complete the quiz, you are taken to this. Now, scraping from the British Library's newspaper collection, it shows the first inch and the bottom inch of every article at the moment from the Ipswich Journal. And 1 inch was all I could get the copyright holders to let me do. But it's more than enough. So you get this, and then you can fill in a series of questions. Does it have a post date? Saturday's post, Friday's post? Does it have a city? Does it have an actual numerical date, or just last Thursday's Saturday Gazette? Which doesn't make sense, but go with it. And you can fill in this information. Once you do this, it gets automatically sent to me on a Google Docs Excel sheet, which I can go through and validate. So if people just put in curse words, which fortunately nobody's done yet, I can take those entries out. And in the general, people have been extremely diligent. They've been putting in way more detail than I actually expected. And with the initials on the end, they've actually been coming back and doing quite a lot of different editions of it. Once you have that, you do, of course, have to clean up the data. Now, this is something that cannot be done through crowdsourcing. It has to be done by somebody with a bit more contextual knowledge, which is why I've done just the Ipswich Journal at the beginning, so that I have an idea of geography, time, delays, things like that. And I can use a program called OpenRefine to basically consolidate. So, the Gazette spelled all sorts of interesting ways. Sometimes the London Gazette, sometimes not, can be consolidated into a single value. A lot of people wrote Ipswich when it didn't actually say Ipswich Journal. I think they got confused as to which journal they were looking at and which journal was being copied from. That's something I had to change in the directions. But in the end, I was able to take the records, and I was able to make some general initial conclusions. So, from the first batch of respondents, these are all the ones where a city was present. Now, I have to make it really clear, the number of things that even have a city attribution is quite small compared to the whole corpus. We're talking in the less than 15%, usually under 10% in some years. But we still get quite a lot. And as you can tell, and probably not surprisingly, London and Ipswich are the most common locations mentioned for the Ipswich Journal. I was actually surprised at just how much local news was actually being specifically cited as being locally had. But you can tell there's quite a lot of other cities. not all of which would have naturally occurred to me, that this is where they were getting their news, or, shall we charitably say, gossip, for the local news section. And there's quite a few smaller locations over here where there's only one or two mentions. If we look at newspapers, it's a little bit sadder of a story. The newspapers don't get mentioned specifically very much. So whereas we had over 100 cities mentioned, we have 10? 11 newspapers actually specifically cited. Newry Telegraph, Bury Post, the Foreign Office, which I just left it there anyways, the Hampshire Telegraph, and the London Gazette. The London Gazette being the one that Ipswich most often explicitly attributed. So what does this tell me? Well, if I look back at my other map, I would notice that the only one of these that's actually in the British Library corpus that I could actually map with the implicit connections is the Hampshire Telegraph. So all of these other locations aren't showing up through my implicit reprint mapper. So I'm getting a false image of who they're attributing versus who they may implicitly be stealing from. And so I really think that it's only if you combine these two different types of networks that you get a much truer image of where they're copying from. And it gives you a really good insight as to the London Gazette must have been very respectable for its point of view to always attribute it, even though quite a lot of its information was actually coming from other journals in the network. And so how does all of this apply to the people themselves in the early 19th century? Well, I think the Sydney Gazette probably sums it up best for me. When they found out that they were being copied very frequently in Britain, they said, "We feel highly flattered in perceiving that articles are occasionally copied from the Sydney Gazette into the best conducted journals, as well of Great Britain as of India." So it was something they were actually quite proud of to be copied. So it's actually quite sad in a way that they weren't getting the attributions they necessarily deserved. So if you would like to contribute to this project, if you get bored on a train but do have data, please do visit scissorsandpaste.net/Georgian Pingbacks. These slides are available on SlideShare, and you get to see the nice animation as well. And if anyone would like a copy of any of my data that I've used, if you want to mine it yourself for your own nefarious reasons, I do have some cards here that will direct you to my data sets themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.